Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, as several young Sikh men have died under deeply suspicious circumstances in the Punjab recently, now being described as fake encounters, we ask the question if the Punjab police, under Modi's watch, are deliberately reverting back to the policy of the 1980s that saw mass extrajudicial killings of Sikhs. And talking of Punjab's bloody history, we examine the rioting of the 1960s and how it contributed to the establishment of today's Khalistan movement. And sitting against this democratic movement, of course, is the RSS and its international equivalent, the HSS. We also take a look at its own history. And finally, in London, India's Home Minister Jaishankar was welcomed by a crowd of Sikhs, letting their feelings known as they always do when they meet distributors of such injustice. All this and more on today's show. But joining me for Perspectives, as always, is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our viewers out there. We have a new feature that'll be coming up starting next week, is when we post on the screen original articles that are written by either Angus or myself. We'll actually post them up on the section of YouTube that you'll be able to take those images of the articles and print them off or share them, whatever you want to do. So yeah, just a new feature to help bring you the information and allow you to use it as well as you wish. So again, some changes coming, and it's always exciting, Angus. New ways to interact with the viewers.
Always trying to innovate here on Sat Lunch. But James and I together will be bringing you, as always, our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And we will, of course, be taking a look at loads of your great comments at the end of the show. So do stay tuned for that. Right, James, let's get the show underway. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
Well, we talk a lot about the partition of 1947. We talk a lot about the 1980s, in particular 1984, but a lot of things that really have influenced these events or come from the partition. And one of those was the major riots and upheaval that happened throughout the 1960s. Now, the 1960s were a tumultuous era in India, and a lot of that was the carryover and distrust and anger that came out of the partition in 1947, and it lasted for decades. But in particular, the 1960s saw a lot of communal warfare or violence going on in the form of riots and other issues that came out. And we've talked about this before, about rapes and about beatings and even murders in public. And in the 1960s, this was no exception. So in the 1960s, there was the violence and a lot of other issues that had influence for decades to come, and even to this modern day. Now, it's important to understand a lot of the context of what's happened in India over we could even go back a century to the Sikh Empire and British rule and all of that. But I thought it was important to bring some context to the 1960s riots and explain a bit about that and their impact, because we do talk a lot about the other instances, but this had a big influence on what followed. And of course, we know that the 1947 partition left deep scars, and it fostered an environment of mistrust and fear throughout the religious communities. And this involved not only the Hindus and the Sikhs, but also a very large amount in the 1960s geared towards the Muslim population in India as well. Now, there were political factors for the rise and identity of politics being the use of communal politics for mobilization. And with that, of course, what happened was that you had the different sectors, the different religious groups, and the different leaders of such clashing for control of the larger population and the larger regions, and really feeling that the minorities had a voice that was left out of a lot of decisions being made. Now, those tensions really came up in 1960s, but we don't have a lot of solid data in terms of the numbers of injuries and the numbers of dead. There were not a lot of records kept, and even still, a lot of the rioting did destroy records that were available. Now, when you look at other areas, is that the political competition and the pursuit of vote banks sometimes exacerbated existing religious conditions and divisions, but also so did the socio-economical factors, and that was the disparities and competition for resources that could also contribute to the communal tensions. Now, perceptions of discrimination and marginalization fueled resentment and led to the violent clashes. Now, the considerations regarding the Sikh-Hindu relations in the 60s was much referred to the Suba movement, and that was a major factor during this period. And that sought the creation of a Punjabi-speaking state. And that's where it ties into the Khalistan movement of today. Now, back then, there was a lot of communal violence and other violence that took place to try and move that movement forward. Today, it is more of a democratic process and a peaceful process to recognize Khalistan as an independent state. And the movement is not only within the borders of India in our modern day, but through social media and online, as well as, of course, the different diasporas throughout the world. So it's definitely escaped the borders within that region. Now, the movement led to the tensions between the Sikhs and some Hindu communities, and they basically looked at it as a threat to the nation as a whole when you look from the perspective of the Hindu population. And of course, they strongly had opposition to that creation of the Punjab-speaking state. Now, as I said, the linguistic issues that came up and religious issues was that a lot of the whole region spoke in Punjabi, and with the separation of these and the division and the animosity, a lot of the Hindus instead started speaking Hindi, and it really gave more of an isolation to the Punjabi language because it was seen as being very tied in to the beliefs and the system of the Sikhs. So that played a role in that transition in that period. Now, this, of course, also created a lot of polarization within the communal settings throughout India. Now, we do know that there were also other issues that came up, and again, the violence, the rapes, the other things that came up, but also trade and retail and the economy. And believe it or not, a lot of the dispute came from actually cigarette sales and tobacco, as that was a big business for a lot of vendors. And that really showed, because I believe, in my opinion, that because a lot of them were street vendors or just easily accessible vendors, that put a target on them as well. Whereas, there was less ability to target other certain factors of the economy that were playing a role. And when you look at the overall, I pulled up a bit of information on the Jabalpur riots, because there is so many different communal riots that took place throughout India in the 60s. It's really hard to pinpoint, as I said, all of the data that had to do with the violence, the deaths, the injuries, and so forth. So this allowed us just to kind of focus in on one region to give some context of the information. And again, as I said, the economic rivalry was big in the cigarette industry as well as other entrepreneurial areas. But that really had the big tension breaking point. The social tensions were also inflamed by reporting of rape of a Hindu girl by Muslim men and the following suicide of that girl. And the news was heavily charged in the local newspaper and other media sources at the time of the day. And that also was something that a lot of people inside of India and outside look at as a historical influence within the violence that really broke out in this region and others. And that was the heavy influence of the media that encouraged or almost was involved in promoting the riots and the targeting of the minorities. And this, of course, is something that we see today, to this day, still is the utilization of media to polarize communities and to influence, everything from elections to violence to, you name it, and there's so much influence there. The riots involved the violence, the arson, and looting, with significant damage that was focused towards the Muslim-owned properties. And the violence became very widespread and was called for the intervention by the India Army. Now, the official figures state around 55 deaths, primarily Muslims, in that particular riot. However, unofficial accounts have been considerably higher and perhaps as high as 200. And it should be recognized that also since the partition of India and even prior, but when you look at communal violence within the country, you have hundreds of people annually that die as a result of the violence between religious groups and communal groups, and that is to this modern day. So it just shows how some things, as much as they change, they remain the same, or as Angus said in the start there, sometimes, history repeats itself and not in a good way. So again, some of the factors, as I stated, were the media inflaming communal tensions, the economic factors and the underlying tensions, and of course, political reaction to the events, and most notably the reaction of Nehru. And they were seen as not doing enough to intervene and actually prevent violence, instead encouraging it by essentially trying to buy their own voters by promoting the majority and not protecting the minority, Angus. So it just kind of gives a bit of fact there about the rioting in 1960s and how that contributed to the unrest, the genocides, and the history behind what happened in the 80s and 90s as well. And as I said, when history repeats itself, it's not always in a good way, Angus.
Indeed, and we do tend to forget that the 1960s were only really a decade and a bit after partition. So really, it's just the following. It's still suffering the aftermath of those dreadful events of 1947, when this huge exodus of people towards the west, the Muslims moved towards the west, into West Pakistan as it was then, and then of course the Hindus moved east back into what became ultimately mainland India, let's call it. And in between, stuck in the middle, were the Sikhs, who found their own area, their own region, just arbitrarily divided in half, finding one half stuck in Pakistan and the other half in India. And of course, millions died. Literally millions died during this period. It was a terrible period. So the 1960s were only really just a decade and a bit after that. So it was still suffering those sorts of tensions. You don't forget events like that in just 10 or 15 years. It takes a generation or more. Even now we're still suffering the legacy of partition. So it's not surprising there was still deep unrest and still hugely deep divisions amongst the societies, the communities in the region at the time, in those particular regions. There still remains this dreadful division between certainly the Hindu right wing and the Islamic population of India. And we obviously do talk about the minorities being particularly persecuted, but you only need to spend 30 seconds on right-wing Hindutva social media pages to get a flavour of the hatred and the bile that is spat across at the Muslim population. Particularly, they see the Muslim population, the Muslim minority, as trying to take over India. They're trying to take control of India, and it's quite disturbing, really. And this has been really encouraged by the Modi government, and certainly, of course, the RSS that we're going to talk about shortly. But it's interesting, the Suba movement, amongst all this, it's unsurprising then that after the deep betrayal of 1947, the Sikh community, who were promised by all sides, including even Nehru, Gandhi, Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar, all the key figures at the time of partition, they promised the Sikh community that they would have autonomy and likely their own sovereign nation, at least their own region that they would have full autonomy over. In some way, like J&K got some sort of special reserve status within the Indian constitution. That was deeply betrayed. They completely reneged on that promise, and the Sikh community found themselves suddenly just this pawn that was used and abused, and now finding themselves stuck in a region increasingly oppressed by a growing Hindu majority government. So, unsurprisingly, the Suba movement rose up, but the Suba movement, interestingly, was based primarily on language. And this is interesting how it's evolved over time from the Khalistan movement originally in terms of a sovereign homeland for the Sikh community. They argued originally on the basis of language, saying, look, we are a different identity, we're a different culture, of course we're a different religion, but all these other areas are getting their own region, their own sovereign regions, primarily based on language, Hindi for India, etc., Urdu for Pakistan, I think it was at the time. time. So why can't we as Punjabis have our own Punjabi state? And that was basically the premise of the Suba movement, which then in turn evolved over time into a more religious-based, a Sikhi-based argument saying, well, look, we are, as a religion, we are an independent religion. We're not part of Hinduism. Even the constitution tries to perpetuate that lie. That's why it was never signed by the Sikh community. But the Sikh religion is an independent, autonomous religion. It exists on its own. It is a separate religion, and on that basis, it demands its own sovereign homeland in much the way the Muslims got Pakistan and Bangladesh, East Pakistan as it was at the time. The Hindus got India, and in much the same way that Israel, as I often say, the Jewish state was established for Israel. So why couldn't the Sikh community have their own Sikh state of Khalistan? So that was a lot of that. And one of the arguments I always bring into this, James, is the RSS. And this still baffles me. The RSS is this extreme right-wing Hindu nationalist movement. It is always argued for a Hindu Rashtra, basically a sovereign Hindu state that is primarily Hindu, that has a Hindu population and is run along the lines of the Hindu culture. Yeah, absolutely. That is your democratic privilege. By all means, have a Hindu Rashtra, but at the same time, then grant the Sikh community their own sovereign nation, Khalistan, because then everyone's a winner. Nobody who isn't a Hindu wants to be part of a Hindu Rashtra. Why would they? Because Hindu extremism, Hindu nationalism is really exclusive. It is, we are Hindus, we run this nation on behalf of the Hindu population, to the exclusivity of anybody else. So nobody else would want to live in a Hindu Rashtra. That's fine. But then why not argue for Khalistan? Why not grant Khalistan? Because then you immediately get rid of your biggest existential threat, the Sikh community, who you are constantly targeting with violence, threats, etc., to your own detriment, to your own reputation. Why not grant the Sikh community Khalistan? It's just a small geographical area, and with that one single political move, you remove your greatest problem, your greatest thorn in your side, and you make tens of millions of Sikhs extremely happy, who will likewise become, I have no doubt, an ally in the region to you as well. So, James, as I often argue, I don't understand why the RSS don't actually support the Khalistan movement. It would actually do them a favour.
And at the end of the day, let's take a common sense approach to it. Angus, is that either they're going to succeed or they're going to fail. If they succeed, they make the region stronger and they are a great ally for the rest of India. If they fail, they could have safeguards in place that it would then revert back to India control, as opposed to becoming under the rule of Pakistan or others, where there could be an agreement reached. And again, I don't see it ever failing, but I think that it would contribute greatly to Pakistan, to India, and the rest of the region in terms of what they bring to the table, to set an example as to how the whole region can get rid of the historic violence in the communal settings and actually demonstrate how peace can bring forward change and advancement in so many areas, Angus. And with that said, a lot of times when we're talking about these issues and we bring them up, we talk about the RSS, about RAW, and different agencies. And some people, it occurred to me, may not really understand what the RSS is, what the HSS is, and the difference with RAW. So I thought that for our viewers, we would do a series of information and learning about this. And tonight we're just going to start with a quick overview of the RSS, the HSS, and how it differs from, of course, RAW. And that, I think, would be helpful for some people to get the context that maybe don't know the history. And again, like us, Angus, we are learning all the time, and yeah, we're bringing everyone that views our show along the journey. So we're not just focused on the Sikh community; we are focused on also exploring the Sikh history, the culture, and everything else that comes with it, and sharing that knowledge with others outside of the Sikh community, so that there's more understanding, so there's less, less fear in the community saying we don't understand the Sikh community, we don't understand the history, the culture. This bridges that gap as a part of the goal for this show. And I thought, yeah, what a great way to bring it forward than to really give a clear understanding. Now, the RSS and the Research and Analysis Wing are two separate entities altogether. The Research and Analysis Wing, or also known as RAW, is the spy and intelligence agency for India. That is a government organization, whereas the RSS is more of a separate unit of themselves and more of, I would almost call them a militia, Angus, in terms of the definition for our broader audience. Now, with that, they were found, we'll start with the RSS, and they were founded in 1925 by K.B. Hedgewar. And the RSS is a Hindu nationalist organization, and that's where it differs from RAW being a government spy agency. Its core ideology is the Hindutva, emphasizes the concept of Hindu nation, and the RSS aims to unite and strengthen the Hindu community, promoting cultural and nationalistic views. Now, of course, they want to make it look like it's unicorns and rainbows, but there's also a darker side to the RSS that we'll look at throughout the series as it continues next week. Now, the RSS has been subject of controversy with allegations of involvement in communal violence, which we've touched on. And there have been actually several points throughout India's history that the RSS has been banned and was seen as a terrorist organization or outlaws. And that is important to notice as well, especially when you look at how India defines terrorism and opposition people. So people who just speak out against the BJP could be given that label. But as you'll learn throughout this series, the RSS really has earned that badge, we'll say, Angus. It's not a badge of honor by any stretch. And the RSS has a large network of affiliated organizations that operate in various sectors of society. Now, the HSS is the international wing of the RSS. That was as they grew and expanded and really pushed their agenda onto the world stage, but also so that they could interfere and have influence on the Sikh and other minority diasporas throughout the world. And that is something that we see still today with that foreign influence and foreign interference. The transnational repression is not just at the hands of the India government and the RAW agency and other government agencies, but also at the hand of the HSS. And we've seen different examples of that even in the past year with the protests and the violence that broke out at various temples and gurdwaras in Ontario and throughout Canada. Now, they play a significant role within the India politics and society, especially with their association with the BJP political party and Narendra Modi. And really, that is where that closeness has caused a lot of blurred lines and a lot of crossover. When people look at RAW or the RSS, now it's getting a lot more blurred and a lot more crossover. So I think that was important just to bring up and to point out for our viewers, especially those without the knowledge of the history of it all. Now, they conduct or have different branches that provide physical training, ideological education, and community service. So again, they have those different things, but let's not be fooled. They also have some very nefarious branches of training, whether that is in gathering intelligence or playing out different acts of violence or even, extrajudicial killings, as we've spoke of before, and promoting the divide between other communities, such as the Sikh and the Muslims, the Dalits, the Christians, and so forth. So it's all about creating an agenda that moves forward their Hindutva ideals. And that includes even today with the social media factor, and we'll talk about that next week. And Russia actually just the other day, in an interesting side point, got caught on it was X, formerly Twitter, where they actually, the funny part is Russia ran out of credits to keep their IPAs and their bots going, and the actual code for the bots that targeted viewers on X were exposed. So we'll talk about that next week anyway. Now, RSS activities include organizing cultural events, education programs, and community service, and a lot of those were also cover for their planning and execution of different nefarious events throughout history, different acts of violence, and different acts that they were organizing towards the other groups and minorities. And they have really faced scrutiny regarding their ideologies and activities outside of India now because of the presence of the RSS and the HSS in countries outside of India, including Canada, the US, Indonesia, you name it, they are spreading out that activity. And that just goes to show how the global world is getting smaller to that reach. Now, let's take a quick look at RAW and what RAW is. Now, as I said, that is the spy agency and intelligence gathering agency of the government of India, and they were established in 1968. Now, their main objectives include gathering foreign intelligence, counterterrorism, and protecting India's national interests, which they use as an excuse for foreign murders such as that of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Surrey, British Columbia. Now, they also claim to be gathering intelligence, counterterrorism, and protecting the interests, again, trying to use those as excuses to push the BJP or to give the BJP power to make laws that actually close up the ranks when it comes to the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech by India's citizens, no matter what religious background or other background that they come from. And they play, of course, a major role in their foreign and domestic policy and influence within different international waters when it comes to security and activities when it comes to global security. So RAW conducts covert operations, which we've already discussed, and intelligence gathering analysis, but they also have, basically sweatshops of a modern era where they utilize, hundreds of millions of dollars a year in budgetary resources to target and influence foreign policy and the policy of different governments and communities. And so with that, it kind of gives a quick overview as to the two different organizations and how they differ and, the formation and how they've grown. But we will take a look at a bit more in depth in different areas that they act next week. And we want you to join us for that. But on that, Angus, we've seen a lot of examples of how the RSS has grown over the decades and just really still has that international movement that they participate in.
Yes, we talk a lot about the RSS for obvious reasons, and it's been around for a very long time. It is very well established. It is very powerful. It has its fingers all over, literally, the world, particularly through its form of the HSS, we also talk a lot about. And it's deeply financed. It's well resourced, which does make it extremely effective and extremely powerful. And unfortunately, they have in their target, they have the Sikh community, because they realise the Sikh community is one of its deepest existential threats back home domestically in India.
That's right.
So that is why really the RSS has become such a bogeyman, as we call, for the Sikh community. But it's dangerous for India as well, because it is this extremist movement. It is essentially, it was originally a militant movement. So it does have some roots in violence. And even today now, its membership includes many members of the Lok Sabha, the Indian Parliament. Narendra Modi himself was actually part of the RSS, still remains part of the RSS. He was nurtured, he was brought up through the ranks of the RSS in his time in Gujarat as he grew up. So the RSS have deeply got its claws into the government of India and indeed its very own Prime Minister. And one wonders, well, is this healthy for any democracy? Of course it's not. This movement is known as an extremist movement. It is a far right-wing movement that has all sorts of quite dangerous ambitions and aspirations. But this is controlling the Indian government. Again, this is not good for any democracy. We certainly wouldn't tolerate that here in the West, in any nation. We wouldn't tolerate any extremist movement effectively controlling our governments. It would have been stopped legally, morally, on every level. It would have been stopped. Yet this prevails in India. The HSS we talk a lot about. It is extremely powerful. It has infiltrated academia, law enforcement, even big tech. We know Google, etc., is influenced by the HSS and HSS organisations. It's very well funded. We often talk about this figure of $400+ million a year that is channeled into this whole movement. So where that money comes from, one can only guess. But certainly that is channeled into this movement to push this right-wing Hindu extremist nationalist agenda. So of course that money is effective. It works. It does have a strong influence. It's certainly through the diaspora and through domestic politics here in the UK. Certainly we've seen it in Canada and to some degree in the United States as well, and of course other nations. So it's an interesting look into what the RSS are up to. I think they do need to. I think the world needs to understand just how powerful this organisation is, how influential it is, because it does actually have quite a significant impact on global affairs, and it really needs to be called out, James, and we must continue to do so.
Yeah, absolutely, Angus. And in the interest of time, I kind of went over there, so I'll just throw it right back to you to jump into your stories.
Indeed, thank you, James. As always, we're up against the clock. So, okay, my first story. It's not a nice one actually. I've talked recently about there have been quite a few incidents in the Punjab, particularly, where there have been some killings of young Sikh men. And this is actually, this is starting to form a bit of a concerning pattern. And there's an article that's actually appeared, I think, overnight on the Satluj news website. I'm just going to pick out a few points from this article because it does actually channel us through to really the conclusions that we are, I would say, quite worryingly drawing. The article states that a 20-year-old lone progeny of a poor and underprivileged Sikh family, Mohit Singh, was killed recently by police in its custody and was shown killed in an encounter by the police by a fabricated story that seems to be happening a little bit too often. The police linked the Sikh youth to the mysterious blasts which have been occurring in Punjab over the last few months. Nobody's been hurt by these blasts. Mohit, who is a resident of Buddha Di Kuli in Batala of Gurdaspur district, was linked to explosives in Amritsar's Jantipur and Batala's Raimal. Now, after the encounter, the police told the same story. The accused had concealed arms and ammunition at an isolated place. He was taken for its recovery. Upon reaching the spot, the accused opened fire at the police to evade custody, and in response, the police acted in, quote, self-defense, and they killed him. Now, in December, just a couple of months ago, again, we reported this story. 3 Sikh youths from Gurdaspur district, the same area, were killed in a fake encounter. And in an attempt to pave the way for a crackdown on pro-freedom Sikh sections in the Punjab, the police linked the deceased to the same old story, the ISI, the intelligence agency of Pakistan, and called them members of what they called a terror module. And issuing a statement regarding this encounter, Punjab Police DGP Gaurav Yadav had said, in a major breakthrough against Pakistan's ISI-sponsored Khalistan Zindabad Force, the KZF, that they referred to as a terror module, a joint operation of Punjab Police and Uttar Pradesh Police has led an encounter with 3 module members involved in a grenade attack at a police establishment in Gurdaspur. Now, these youths were already in the custody of the police. Almost all of them left the house a week earlier. The families heard nothing from them. Their phones had been switched off, so they literally just vanished a week earlier. Like Mohit Singh, all these 3 youths belonged to poor families. One youth was illiterate. They had no background, no absolute background at all of violence. They had no criminal backgrounds. 4 days after the killing of Mohit Singh, a court of the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation, pronounced judgment in a 32-year-old fake encounter case. In this judgment, convicted 2 former Tantaran police officials were convicted at the Patti police station of murder, again, one of fake encounters. Now, all this information is really forming a bit of a pattern. It's quite a worrying pattern. And as the article says, justice delayed is justice denied, as we're seeing again, a lot of these policemen who were involved in fake encounters, these extrajudicial killings back in the 80s, are only just, several of them are only just being brought to justice, but most of them have died since. And what the story that's been uncovered by the CBI in a lot of their more recent investigations is that, again, the same story is unfolding, that the bodies of these young Sikh men who were murdered back in the 1980s, who were disappeared and basically killed in these fake encounters, their bodies were cremated. The bodies were quite often unclaimed, and they were taken away for cremation. And I do urge you to watch my podcast tomorrow with Dr. Singh Grewal, where we talk about Jaishankar Singh Kalra, who uncovered a lot of this evidence. One of the ways he uncovered evidence and proof of these fake encounters back in the 1980s was, of course, the government and the police at the time were hiding all the evidence. They were burying it. There was no records. There were no official records of these killings, these murders. But what Jaishankar Singh Kalra did was he went to the crematoriums, the crematoria. He uncovered the actual evidence of the burnings, the cremations of these dead, and he actually managed to collate evidence of these of what they called orphans, people who had allegedly had no family. In fact, they were these young Sikh men who had been murdered by the police and who were quietly taken to the crematoria to be cremated anonymously. And so that's how he uncovered how many were being murdered, and then, of course, the numbers came up to at least 25,000. So that is what was going on then, and of course, this is now starting to re-emerge. This same process is starting to re-emerge, where bodies are disappearing and they are being cremated anonymously. And the CBI is starting to collect evidence of certainly of the disappeared from those, but more recently of what's been happening with these young men. And the article actually finishes saying, the present police officials are playing the same tactics of hunting Sikh youths as were used by their predecessors during Sikh militancy. So basically what it's saying, and this is a pattern that is starting to emerge, and I think it is worth highlighting, are the Punjab police reverting back to tactics that they used in the 1980s, where, politically driven by the RSS and by the ruling elite of India, who saw the Sikh movement, and particularly the pro-Khalistan movement, as a threat, as an existential threat to their control and rule of India, they then used the law enforcement agencies, the police, and people like KPS Gill, the butcher of Punjab, who oversaw the Punjab police, using the local police as a mechanism to murder their political opponents. And we're now seeing that young Punjabi Sikh youths are being killed in these encounters that are now being dressed up as fake encounters. They're saying, oh, they were militants, they were terrorists, they used guns against us, so we were acting in self-defense, that's why we killed these young men. Yet these young men had no background in violence, they had no criminal background. They were from poor families who, of course, can't speak up, they can't challenge the police, they can't challenge the legal system to saying, look, this was just plain old cold-blooded murder. These were extrajudicial killings. The police know this. They know they can get away with this. So the big question, James, and this is a very concerning question, there is a pattern starting to form here of young Sikh men are starting to be killed by the police in the Punjab. They are being blamed, the killings are being blamed on the fact that they were militants, they were Khalistanis, they were armed, they were dangerous young terrorists. That's why they were killed in self-defense by the police. Again, it's a really questionable legal premise of what's going on. Now, we've often reported how people like Amritpal Singh have been used and abused by the so-called legal system of India. They've been imprisoned under very questionable legal premises, under the National Security Act, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, etc., that has a very low threshold to imprison somebody effectively forever. And that's what's happened to Amritpal Singh, amongst many others, by the BJP government, because they are seen as a political threat. Is this now cascading down to local police forces, who are now starting to think, okay, it's now okay, we are getting endorsement from the Indian government to target the Sikh community, and if it's okay to imprison them, well, it's just another short step to reverting back to the 1980s under the premise of, look, these guys are terrorists, I think we are justified in killing them, in taking them out of the countryside and killing them and dressing it up as self-defense because they were terrorists after all. Are we sinking back into the bad old days of the 1980s? I don't know, but there is a pattern forming here, James, and it really needs calling out. If more of these extrajudicial killings start occurring, then really it is a dangerous move in the Punjab and surrounding regions that the Sikh community is being deliberately targeted by police. We do know the police have been targeting them already. They're dragging them in under arrest, particularly if they stand up to the drug infiltration of the Punjab. We've seen many members standing up against the drug movement who've been arrested and tortured and reappearing sort of several weeks later, covered in blood and bruises and electro-torture burn marks on their bodies. It's just a short step from that, James, to killing these people. And again, it's a worrying trend. We must keep an eye on this and we must keep highlighting it, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And of course, we know that oversight and accountability are not big words when it comes to law enforcement and government agencies within the country of India. And unfortunately, the oversight and accountability factor when it comes to NGOs and international human rights organizations are also stymied by the fact that they have been essentially labeled terrorist groups or propaganda groups, including organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others. And that makes it very hard for the international community to get a lot of facts as well, because a lot of times we do revert to the reports that are compiled and the information gathered by the organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch to really keep an eye on governments and human rights abuses. And of course, India has really put the walls up to try to prevent that information from being disseminated and spread throughout the world.
Indeed. And again, once again, it's just yet another argument for the establishment of Khalistan, because there is no way that the Sikh community will ever be safe from this sort of persecution until they have their own sovereign homeland. And that is really, to me, the only solution for this. Right, James, let's move on. And the Sikh community, as we often say, the reason why they are such a target of people like the RSS and the Indian state is because they will always stand up to persecution. They will always stand up for injustice. They will always stand up for minorities who are persecuted by any totalitarian regime. And this is why last night here in London, the Sikh community turned out in force against the arrival of Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister. Apologies, I called him the Home Minister in the introduction. He's, of course, the External Affairs Minister of India, who was visiting London to give a presentation to an organisation called Chatham House. Now, Dr. Jaishankar is part, obviously, of the BJP government. He is quite a controversial figure. He is accused by the Sikh community of forming a fundamental part, a pillar, a foundation, let's call it, of this transnational repression policy that is seeing Sikh men murdered overseas, intimidated, harassed and murdered by the Indian state. So as a result, unsurprisingly, the Sikh community mobilised itself, as it often does so wonderfully, to protest his arrival at Chatham House. Now, Chatham House is it's a very well-known think tank in London. It is actually it is a pretty unbiased, a pretty impartial think tank. It does produce a lot of very powerful and influential information pieces. It produces a lot of reports and documents that are widely respected. Of course, they are therefore very influential. So when somebody like Dr. Jaishankar presents to Chatham House, it does raise concerns because his input may influence Chatham House and, of course, the reports that they produce, which in turn will influence government policy. So this is why it was really important that Jaishankar's arrival was met by the Sikh community to highlight the fact that this guy is not who he claims. This guy is part of a rogue regime, and a regime that is not democratic, that does not stand on top of a democratic nation, that is pushing a policy that is essentially written and controlled by the RSS, an extremist right-wing nationalist community. And they therefore do not represent a nation that should be respected and received by a think tank as well respected as Chatham House. So I'm delighted to say that Jaishankar was indeed met by a large sea of Khalistan flags. And I just want to play you just a quick video that has emerged. Let me just play you this. This is what he was met with. So they saw a great group. Well done, guys. Well done for turning up for that. And Mr. Jaishankar was left in absolutely no doubt about the strength of feeling of the Sikh community. And of course, he was met by that wonderful sea of yellow Khalistan flags. Again, great to see. Now, unsurprisingly, now you've seen that. You actually saw what happened there. And in fact, that gentleman ran out in front of Jaishankar's car holding an Indian flag, and he tore it in front of the car. No violence involved. He literally just ran out in front of the car. The car wasn't moving. He just ran in front of the car, tore at that flag. The police officers ran in to grab him and bundle him back behind the lines. No violence, purely, it was all peaceful as you saw. It was very, let's say, exuberant, and it was very enthusiastic, but certainly there was no violence there, lots of shouting and just a very typical peaceful democratic process, I would call that, and exuberant is the way I would describe it. Yet, unsurprisingly, the Indian press have been all over this. The headlines have been violence, Khalistan extremists launched an attack. They attacked Jaishankar, etc. This is the typical emotive language from the Gaudiya media. So you saw what happened there. There is the fact, the violence that they call that attack against Jaishankar, that physical attack against Jaishankar. Well, all it was a Sikh protester, a Khalistani protester running out, holding the Indian flag and tearing it in half. I don't see that as an attack against Jaishankar, but there, as we often like to say, look, we bring you the truth, we bring you the facts of the matter. That's what really happened. The camera in that case did not lie, and you even see the police smiling. You even saw the guy himself. Well done to him, sir. Well done. We salute you for that. We saw him smiling. It was all very jolly. It was very peaceful. It was very passionate. Let's not forget it was an extremely serious and passionate protest, but it was friendly. It was amicable, certainly amongst the police and the protesters. There was no violence there. There was nothing. There was certainly no violent attack against Mr. Jaishankar. So for anybody who has any doubt about how partisan the Indian press are, there you go. That's the facts laid out. And in fact, in one of the press releases, BJP national spokesperson RP Singh told ANI, yes, the absolute ultimate Gaudiya outlet, ANI, who printed this quote, "There are about 100 to 150 people across London who do such things. They do this just to draw people's attention. They neither have a base there nor supporters here in India." And he then referred to them as Khalistani extremists and terrorists. Well, I've got news for you, Mr. BJP national spokesman. They're not just 100 to 150 people across London who do such things. There are thousands across the whole of the UK who do such things, because the Sikh community is angry, they are mobilised, and they are strongly supported by hundreds of thousands in the diaspora, and they are supported by millions even domestically in India. Whether you like it or not, and whether you recognise it or not, you refuse to recognise the fact, but they were there, and they are certainly there to draw people's attention, as they have done, and we will continue to highlight, James. So well done to the guys in London, well done for turning up, Mr. Jaishankar, and indeed any press that were there. You saw what happened. There was certainly no attack. It was a peaceful democratic protest, and more importantly, the Khalistan flag was there proud and loud, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And, when you have even the peaceful protests in numbers, there's still an anxiety, a fear, an apprehensive attitude by everyone, and that includes police and the subjects of the protests or the rallies. And here you can see that just isn't even really the case. The police, the subject of the rally, and all that, everybody is more relaxed. There's smiles. That shows that there was even a reduced level of even concern of a threat. So yeah, it just shows that it was definitely peaceful, it was calm, and it was excitable and loud, and that's where, people have to still be on their guard. But again, it just is contrary to a lot of the rallies and protests that you see. And the fact that it looks like a cameraman right behind the police there, that they didn't move him back or her, that just goes to show as well that they didn't feel there was a big threat here. It was a peaceful event, and that is what Khalistan and the referendum movement and such are getting known for, and that is their peaceful ability to raise awareness, to capture, the media and other things. But unfortunately, as we know, the other side is still just trying to use it as a negative propagation of misinformation, Angus.
Indeed, and just to confirm the facts, as far as we are aware, there were no charges, no arrests, which therefore implies there was absolutely no attack and no violence. So, as we colloquially say, stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Godi Media. Those are the actual facts. So, on that note, James, let us move on to our comments column. Right, Gurtej Singh Grewal, this is a fascinating comment. Thank you for this comment. I really enjoyed reading this comment. Really interesting one, this, James. Now, Gurtej Singh Grewal said he listened to Red FM recently, where a Harvard professor shed a lot of light about the background, the actual, almost the genetic, demographic background of the Punjabi people going back through a long-term history. Now, apparently, in that current Punjabi, they used to live near the Black Sea. They had a gypsy lifestyle, so they were very transient. They travelled around a lot. They were mostly used as mercenaries. They were contracted by kings to fight alongside them as fighters. So again, this wonderful military capability, this military heritage, obviously goes back centuries, and as thus they were great fighters, and they were used as mercenaries by all sorts of the ruling elite throughout history. And they were paid handsomely because their performance was so great. They were paid in gold and weaponry. And in fact, they were so successful that, as you rightly say, their horses were even wearing golden ornaments. Now, after some time, due to trade, most of them started to settle in Punjab. It may be because of the productive flat land and the fertile land and the good water supplies, but then some moved to North America and others to Europe. Then in the 1400s, of course, Guru Nanak Dev Ji founded Sikhi in the Punjab region, and a couple of centuries they then evolved to become Sikhs, as we know the Sikh community today. But it also resembles current migration trends. Most of the Punjabi moved out from Punjab to North America, but of course other parts of the world. Of course, this is now the diaspora as we know it today. The professor from Harvard was stating we have more things in common genetically than other Indian populations. So what you say? So what the Harvard professor was saying is that Sikhs actually have more in common genetically with people from outside India, and particularly the West, than they do with India, which is interesting. And that does align with so much that we talked about. He also picked up surnames such as Man or Gill that are similar in other cultures. In fact, yes, I know several Gills actually, with a little bit differently spelled. Thank you. You said that you found that interesting and like to share it. Yeah, Gurtej Singh Grewal, that is a fascinating comment. I urge people to read that in more detail. We've had to rush through it, of course. But basically what it's saying is that the people of the Punjab, the indigenous people of the Punjab, are actually only indigenous because originally, going back several centuries, they actually travelled around. They originated near the Black Sea. They became these wonderfully, powerfully successful mercenaries, these fighters who then settled in the fertile area of the Punjab, the Five Rivers area. And that's where the origins of Punjabis, modern Punjabis, came from. And ironically, in turn, since then, they've actually moved back out under the persecution of the Indian government and the Indian state. Yeah. They've actually gone back, as it turns out, back to areas like North America and Europe and what have you. But that does explain, James, genetically why actually we are so aligned, why we seem to think the same, why we are so aligned in terms of our philosophy and outlook here in the West with the Sikh community, James.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I had no idea. So it just demonstrates again how our viewers are teaching us as well. And for anybody new to the platform, for our comment section, just scroll down and you'll find all these comments that you can read in more detail or take more time to review. So yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that comment. It was very interesting and informative.
Yeah, thank you, Gurtej, for that. That was a fantastic comment, really interesting, and certainly we didn't know that. Free spirit. No, James and Angus, it is not Khalistan, it's Khalistan. It's 100% Khalistan. Whoever said it's Khalistan may be hiding behind a Sikh identity, if you know what I mean. Wink, wink. And yes, James, you had it right. Someone is just trying to blow smoke, beware. So what Free Spirit is actually saying is this was a bit of mischief by somebody. It's not Khalistan, it's Khalistan. They're trying to put us off track. I don't know if that's true, James. Who knows? We are just here just to pass on comments like this. I was going to say not pass judgment,
exactly,
but we do.
Angus. People, different pronunciations, different dialects, different accents. But again, others that just want to get us in trouble.
Absolutely, and I have no doubt this one will just run and rumble on in much the same way as the Sikh and Sikh argument runs on, and likewise Punjab and Punjab. So, but it's great fun, so do keep those comments going. SSI Singh, you made this comment. I couldn't quite work out where you were actually referring to. You're asking why MI5, that's our domestic intelligence service here in the UK, why MI5 aren't intervening or questioned on the matter. Now, unfortunately, I was trying to work out which story you were referring to on that. But what I would say, and I did bring out this comment actually, because MI5 have been heavily involved in the Sikh community domestically. I have to say, sadly, in more of a negative light than a positive light, as far as we know. On a positive side, they have been involved in identifying Indian agents working for the Indian government under transnational oppression, and they have issued and helped the police service issue these warnings to members of the Sikh community. So at least MI5, I guess, a lot of presumption here, but I have no doubt that MI5 have been involved in uncovering evidence of threats against the Sikh community, and they have passed on those threats to local law enforcement, who have warned members of the Sikh community, many of whom I have met, who live under this fear of transnational oppression from India. So MI5 in a positive way have been involved in that. In a negative way, they were involved, for example, in passing intelligence to their counterparts in India, RAW, James, we were talking about earlier. We do know that they passed information and intelligence to RAW about Jaggi, for example, and particularly about the West Midlands 3 and about several members of the Khalistan movement based in the West Midlands, again, several of whom I have had the privilege of meeting and talking to. So MI5 have worked with their Indian counterparts. And not in a good way, certainly passing powerful, dangerous intelligence that has allowed the Indian government to target and persecute members of the Sikh community here in the UK, particularly around Birmingham. So, James, it's not great. I'm always a supporter of our intelligence services, but when it does serve the Indian government, I'm not such a supporter. I don't think that's such a good thing. CSIS, on the other hand, I don't know, James, probably not as clear-cut either, I would say, in Canada.
Absolutely. And keeping in mind as well, to take that a step further, is whether it's MI5, CSIS, CIA, there's a lot of dossiers that are compiled and given to politicians that are under the guise of national security or top secret levels. So therefore, we don't know about them as the public. But let's keep in mind that they do a lot behind the scenes that really plays out in terms of policy, in negotiating international, whether it is the diplomatic attempts to get Jaggi home or other things. So again, it's really hard because we don't have that transparency when it comes to our different organizations, including CSIS, MI5, and so forth, Angus.
Indeed, and by definition, they really have a dirty game to play. They play in a dirty world where the rules are very different in the shadows, and all we can hope is that they certainly do act in our best interest, and hopefully the best interest of the Sikh community ultimately. We've got to rush through because we're running out of time. Icon Car says, Kisan Hul Khalistan means farmer's solution is Khalistan. Thank you for that input. Thank you for that translation, because we did ask, what on earth does Kisan Hul Khalistan mean? Thank you for letting us know. That's very useful. Handa Video says, that's why Indian government doesn't want Khalistan. Well, all I would say to that, there's 100 reasons why the Indian government doesn't want Khalistan. But all I would counter that, James, as I said earlier, the Indian government should want Khalistan, particularly if it is run by the RSS, because it is in the RSS's interest to have Khalistan, James, as I often say.
Exactly. And, I guess just not a big enough briefcase to bribe Modi and others.
Indeed. Pritam Korman, again, I wish we had more time to spend on this comment because it's a really important one. You talked about Mark Tully, of course, this BBC journalist who broadcast from Punjab, from Amritsar in 1984. He was bussed away, like all the journalists, just prior to the attack on the Harmandir Sahib. All the journalists were put on a bus and driven driven to the border of the Punjab and dropped off deliberately by the Indian government because they knew shortly, hours later, that the Indian army were going to attack the Harmandir Sahib. They didn't want journalists, particularly people like Mark Tully, to witness this and report to the world what happened, so they would deliberately bust away. Mark Tully then rushed back to the Golden Temple as soon as he was physically capable. He reported he saw the evidence of what happened. He saw the dreadful aftermath of what happened there, and he actually reported that the Indian government were calling even those, as you rightly say, Preetam Corman, those who escaped for their lives as terrorists. It was an absolute shame, capital letters, as you rightly say, James. It was a deep stain on Indian history, and the fact that they deliberately drove journalists like Mark Tully away from the area to hide what they did is an absolute national shame, James.
Exactly, and that's, so much of the reason why we have such a hard time trying to pinpoint documentation and factual evidence there, and that's a big part of it. It was all hidden and covered up.
Indeed, and our last set of comments, Hardal saying thank you for highlighting this. Yes, the story of Sheikh Cousineau will stand trial for crimes. Yes, Bangladesh, the new Bangladesh government are hauling Hasina and her whole family, or trying to haul her, extradite her from India, where she's hiding, back to Bangladesh to face justice. Unfortunately, it's a story I haven't had time really to put together. I wanted to cover this, but so many other stories have taken precedence. Hopefully we may cover this next week. It does actually, interestingly, implicate a member of the British Labour government, Tulip Siddiq, who was the niece of Sheikh Hasina. Again, a whole big story. Thank you, Hardal Singh, for raising that. We haven't had time to cover it. I would dearly love to cover it. Maybe we will next week. So thank you for highlighting that. Hindu Crusher says, beautiful thumbnail. Thank you. This is a bit of self-indulgence. I spent a lot of time putting these thumbnails together. They take a lot of thought. And thank you for that appreciation. Just thank you. It meant a lot, because it's always hard putting a thumbnail together. There's a whole art to it, James, as I'm sure you're aware, on YouTube.
Absolutely. And just for clarification, that's all credit to Angus there. I have nothing to do with the thumbnails. That is the genius sitting on the other side of the show in England.
Indeed, I'm not an artist. I know very little about graphics. I'm certainly not technical, so I do tend to try and cobble these together as best as I can. So when somebody appreciates it, thank you, because a lot of effort goes into it. Much appreciated. Final comment goes to John Kalo. Satellite TV, bravo! No one yet raises the voice of Sikhs except you guys. Please keep continuing as the universal leader is watching. The universe leader is watching you for your goodness. Well, I certainly hope so, James. But certainly, we're not the only, as we say, we're not the only voice of the Sikhs. There are many, many others. We are just a small voice, and it's the others. It's those who've more courage than us, who campaign more actively, who are out there in the streets. For example, those guys in London. They're the real heroes. Those are the people who really we should be saluting, James. And those are the people who we are more than honoured and happy and privileged to report on a daily basis, James.
Absolutely. And we can take that a step further as all the people getting out to have their voices heard in the referendums and speaking out publicly. So don't forget, the next referendum vote is in Los Angeles, March the 23rd. Make sure you mark your calendar.
Indeed, but unfortunately, as time has beaten us once again, we must rush through to a conclusion. But you have, of course, been watching Perspectives. Please don't forget to keep those comments coming in. We do really appreciate them. Some fantastic comments have come in. Thank you for those. Really interesting to read them and really interesting to talk about them at the end of the show. So do keep those coming in. Don't forget you can message us directly at message@satellitetv.com on anything you'd like to bring to our attention that you don't want to put in the public domain. But in the meantime, that is it for another week. Thanks so much for staying with us. Thanks so much for your loyalty. Do keep watching. We will see you next time. It is a goodbye from me. It is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next week.